Welcome back to Deep Topics with Shaun. I'm Shaun, your host, and I'm so glad that you're joining us this week for episode 2 of the podcast. If you tuned in last week, we did episode 1, and a lot was covered in that episode. Particularly, I reflected upon various aspects of my life and kind of drew a line throughout the journey that led me to this point of starting this podcast. I also mentioned that this podcast has been a long time coming, and particularly gathering the courage and the vulnerability to take such a step, to believe that my story is worthy of telling and sharing, and to also believe that what I share can impact the lives of others was a profound and significant step to take. So I'm so glad that you're joining me again for episode 2. And I'm also very excited to see where this episode goes. I have some ideas and topics in mind for this episode, and reflecting on some of the wonderful feedback that I received from episode 1. Again, I just want to say I'm so thankful and grateful that you took the time to watch that episode or listen to that episode on Spotify, and to share all your encouraging feedback. One of the most encouraging things that I received from you from last week's episode was your appreciation for my vulnerability in sharing my life journey. And some of the lessons that I shared from last week's episode, particularly about having a higher purpose and about how developing and gathering and finding your higher purpose will make it easier for you to overcome challenges and obstacles in your life. I know that many of you did reach out to me and shared some wonderful feedback about how impactful and significant it was for you to hear that story, and about how relevant it was for you to apply those learnings into your own life. So, following on that train of thought and following on some of the learnings from last week's episode, I firstly want to mention to you that, you know, when you listen to that episode, one of the things that comes to mind was, wow, Shaun, you really did experience some major and significant obstacles and challenges throughout your life. And yet you still have come to a point where you are relatively balanced, relatively calm, relatively stable, and relatively clear in terms of your mental clarity to be able to continue to take steps forward towards your goals and dreams. And one of the most important things about that is that to get to that point took significant inner work. And one of the main things that I mentioned last week that I stumbled upon in my life journey is the practice of meditation. And meditation has been so profound and significant for me that I started a business and I share my meditation practice with those, so that you can also experience some of the learnings that I experienced in my life. So, what I did was that I put together a course called the Stress Relieving Meditation course. And in this course, I recorded 12 video lessons with illustrations that are hand drawn by me, so that I can teach you the specific meditation practice that I personally use to relieve stress regularly in my life, and also to restore a level of mental calm, so that I can make decisions that are more aligned with what I want and less aligned with fears, worries, and stress. And so I hope that you take advantage of this opportunity, which I've linked down below. And when you grab that meditation course for limited time only, I'm offering a free 45-minute coaching call so that I can also help you get clear on what those obstacles, challenges, and stagnation that you might be facing, and help you develop a bit more clarity as well as an action plan so that you can take action on that challenge as soon as possible and overcome it and start to progress and thrive in your life in a way that you really want to. So take advantage of that opportunity. It's linked down below. And that is the stress relieving meditation course that I personally use to regularly relieve stress, that I want to share with you. And for a limited time only, get your free coaching call linked down below. Okay, so we're in week 2, and I went through a lot of my life journey last week, and one of the major themes that came up was just the amount of challenges and strife and struggles and suffering that I experienced at various points, and having had to overcome those challenges before getting to where I am today. So, in this week's episode, I want to bring that together and I want to approach that from the lens of forgiveness. And one of the main things that helped me throughout my journey was to be able to let go of the baggage and the emotional volatility and the stress of holding on to grudges from those individuals who perhaps intentionally and maybe also unintentionally inflict hurt and pain upon me in my life journey. So, one of the earliest memories I have of that, and I mentioned this again, was growing up in a volatile and chaotic environment. And I remember this story of my grandfather at the time, who there was in the family a major narrative about how we had grown up to in a specific religion called Hinduism, and um, there were various stories about various family members that converted to other religions. And one of the family members that converted to a different religion was my grandfather, who very early on in his life converted to Christianity and made that into his career, where he was an evangelist with his wife, and they traveled all throughout the world, spreading news of Christianity and its wonderful benefits for human living. But within my family, the narrative about my grandfather was that there was a sense of superiority that he had taken upon himself in believing that Christianity offered a truth about God that no other religion did. And that sense of superiority often came across in his engagements with us and made us feel like we were inferior humans because we did not align with that narrative about the creator. So very early on, I was introduced to this idea that there were various truths about God and there were various religions about God. And each religion appeared to share a different understanding of what God was. And sometimes people took it upon themselves to believe that their understanding about God was superior to others, and that having their specific understanding made them better, and that they needed to take it upon themselves to essentially convert others into their own doctrine and ideology. In my family, that sense of superiority, it kind of fed through in the way we were looked at by my grandfather. And one thing that became relevant in that time, particularly when I was in grade one and I was between 6 and 7 years old, during that time, I was living with my mom, my grandmother, and my great grandmother in my great grandmother's home. And I mentioned previously that my grandmother and my great grandmother got into an argument, which led to my grandmother leaving to go live with her daughter or my aunt in Pietermaritzburg, and that left behind me, my mom, and my great grandmother living in my great grandmother's home. What I didn't mention last week was that the significance of that argument was so extreme, that my great grandmother took it upon herself to change the owner of that home from my grandmother, who was meant to inherit that house after my great grandmother's death, to then my grandfather. And that is why he was the one who, when my great grandmother passed away, put that house on the market to be sold, because he became the owner after that argument. So, in addition to being looked down upon because my mom, myself, and my grandmother, and at the time my great grandmother, practiced Hinduism, after that argument between my grandmother and my great grandmother, a lot changed. The one thing that changed was that my grandmother moved out of the home to live with her daughter, and that put a lot of financial pressure and stress on my mom and my great grandmother because there was one less income in that home. The second thing that became evident was that the home was now owned by a different individual. So the ownership changed from my grandmother to my grandfather. You know now that my grandfather was a practicing Christian and also an evangelist, and also felt a sense of superiority within his Christian identity. And the fourth thing that happened was that the argument between my grandmother and my great grandmother was so significant and traumatizing to my great grandmother that it shook her entire foundational structure and made her also convert to Christianity, which she then believed would offer her a greater sense of peace in her life than what was being offered to her by Hinduism prior to that. I remember at the time, after that argument, I think my grandmother had already moved out and some changes were beginning to happen in the home. My great grandmother was more distrusting of her daughter, of her granddaughter, and of various of her grandchildren at the time. She was very much distrusting of them after that argument. And I remember this memory of, we used to go into my great grandmother's room to pray, and she had this altar of various Hindu deities set up in her room. And after that argument happened and my grandmother moved out, there was this time that she was converting to Christianity, and she was advised by various individuals to burn those images of the Hindu deities. And I remember the fire set up in the backyard and those Hindu religious iconographies being burned by my great grandmother. And it was very much a dark and heavy time, such a dark and heavy time to lose one's faith in God, or to lose one's faith in the form of God that one worships, and to believe that there is a different God, or there is a different form of God that can offer a better sense of peace and progress than the one that was followed. I did not experience that, but my great grandmother experienced that, and so did various other family members actually, because there are also stories of my mom's brother who also converted to a different religion, Islam. And so you can now see that in my family, individuals were so bewildered by what God was and what God had to offer, and the beliefs in various forms of God, and in some ways believing that they are different gods. And one had to convert one's self to a different religion to be able to worship that God. It created this fractured family dynamic in which one's beliefs influenced how one interacted with the others. And at that point, we were starting to become fragmented piece by piece, where this sect followed Christianity, and this sect followed Islam, and this sect followed Hinduism. And that sect believed that they were better than that one, and that sect believed that they were better than this one. And each sect believed that they knew what God was, and each sect believed that their relationship with God was the truth. And it just was this weird mess of belief systems, inferiority, superiority, and so forth. But the one thing that throughout all this disagreement on who knows what about God and who knows the truth about God, this one thing that remained in my sect, let me say my sect of the family, the Hinduism sect, was this idea of humility and forgiveness. And the theme continued to come through over and over again because last week, when I told you about the situation whereby my great grandmother had developed breast cancer, and within 6 months had rapidly deteriorated in health to the point that she passed away in May of 2006 when I was 12 years old. At the time, I also mentioned that in the household, it was very much a financially distressing time for everyone because there was the income of my great grandmother, which was a pension, and there was the income of my mom, which was her day job. And those were the two incomes sustaining the home and having to pay for rates, water, electricity, and food, and so forth. So, when my great grandmother was becoming very much distrustful of my mom and myself, and more so because of the traumatic nature of the argument that she had with her daughter, who was my grandmother at the time and still is my grandmother. Um, the distrusting nature of that relationship meant that at some point in times, which I don't really have much clarity of the nature of the relationship between my grandmother and my mom, but I know that from what I've heard stories my mom telling is that she experienced some meanness and cruelty in some of the perhaps demands or requests from her grandmother or my great grandmother at the time. But when my great grandmother had developed cancer and was no longer able to get out of bed, it was my mom who continued to wash her, feed her, clothe her, and so forth throughout that time. So the example of forgiveness was very much exemplary in the way that my mom interacted with my great grandmother during the last few months of my great grandmother's life. Another example of forgiveness that came up during that time was that when my grandmother moved out of the home and went to live with her daughter, she was no longer on speaking terms with her mom, who was my great grandmother, and there was very much a tension and a drift between them. But during those last few months, my grandmother came back into the home to live with us and to support and to help take care of my great grandmother or mom at the time. The idea of forgiveness was so strong at the time that there was a moment whereby, from what I remember, there was a priest brought into the home, and there was this reconciliation done between my grandmother and my great grandmother where they spoke to each other and spoke out forgiveness to each other during that time. And it was a very much significant moment because in our family, the idea of forgiveness is one that is often spoken about behind closed doors, but actually speaking out, I forgive you, does not really happen that often. And so when it was made evident and significant for the moment and that relationship at the time, it was a huge moment for the teaching and the lesson and the practice of forgiveness in the family. It was a profound moment. So, there again, we have two examples of forgiveness in that time. And what we can see from that is that individuals had willingness for forgiveness. People had a willingness to forgive. I think that even in our conflicts throughout time and throughout our engagements, one thing that we always have, or I choose to believe this personally, is that we always want to forgive, but we always want to be approached with an apology so that we can free ourselves of the burden of holding the grudge. And so that's the first lesson that I want to share in this video, is that as you can see from the nature of the conflict in my family with various family members, one thing that always came to the forefront and made it easier to practice forgiveness was having the willingness to forgive. And the willingness often means that you approach with an attitude of wanting to do it, of being open to do it, of being willing to do it. And having the willingness is the first step to being able to do forgiveness. And from the stories that I've shared up until this point, you can look at me and as an example to see the profound nature of forgiveness and how it really does support with allowing one to step into great and more wonderful things. So, knowing that willingness to forgive is the first step to practice forgiveness and to making forgiveness a regular and necessary practice in one's life. We now must move into the second lesson for forgiveness. And the second lesson for forgiveness is to understand the negative impact of holding on to grudges. Now, I'm sure that you've heard this before. And the thing that we hear before is often this idea of how sometimes, we can drink the poison and expect the other person to die. And I know that that's a very extreme example to use in this instance, but another, example to use, cutting the nose to spite the face, or an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. There's We continue to hear more and more lessons about how our holding on to negativity causes more destruction than it does resolution. Let's pause there for a second while I take a sip of this tea, which, by the way, is ginseng and spearmint, and very much refreshing at the moment. Okay, so when we understand the nature and the impact of holding grudges, one thing that often comes to mind is that we often end up being the ones that are more hurt by holding on to negativity. And I remember this growing up, and I remember this during the time that I was bullied in high school by, remember, those Indian boys that looked like me and often saw me as a victim and took every opportunity to ridicule me for what appeared to be my authentic expression at the time. And I held on to a lot of negativity. I remember that for all of my high school experience, I was internally angry, rageful, and just a volatile, bubbling pot of hot fury and wrath. That's what I was. That's what I was at the time. And it was not pleasant at all. I believe myself to be justified in my feelings, but the internal experience of holding on to that was way too much. And I think that based on some of the challenges that I faced at the time, I can truly see how problematic it was to hold on to the grudge. But the other thing that comes to mind when we try to understand the negative impact of holding on to grudges is that the negativity often ends up causing internal physical detrimental effects in our body and in our minds. When we hold on to negativity and grudges, we fail to see that the individuals that we might be resentful about may not at all have any idea about the effect they had on us. And only we are experiencing the negative impacts of the resentfulness during the time that we are holding on to it. And so it is kind of counterintuitive and illogical when you think about it that we feel that by holding on to this negativity, that it is serving some type of purpose in helping us heal. But in fact, it is not at all serving any type of purpose, and it is not at all in service of helping our healing journey. It is more so an obstacle to healing and an obstacle to forgiveness. So, having the willingness to forgive and having the willingness to let go and understanding that holding on to grudges only causes negative mental and physical and emotional detrimental effects to the person that's holding on to the grudge, we can now see how letting go also needs willingness and courage at the same time. It needs courage, sometimes to let go of negativity. There is, and Dr. David Hawkins talks about this in his book Power versus Force, that there is a juice that comes from negativity, and we can juice the negativity and we can feed off that juice for a very long time, believing that it is worthwhile to continue to stay in that state. But when we see that there's a secret satisfaction to negativity, and that secret satisfaction in some way is prideful, there can be a pride in being a victim. There can be a pride in being the hurt one. There can be a pride in feeling that you were hurt in some way by someone's transgression. And when you let go of that pride, which needs courage and needs willingness, when you let go, then it starts to unlock a level of clarity and peace internally that can help facilitate the journey of forgiveness that can be so healing. And that is the thing that we want, right? We want to be able to undergo that healing so that we can make space for the great and wonderful things that are to come. And so when we reflect so far on some of the things that we've covered, we can see that from my personal experience and from my individual life journey, I experienced some major obstacles and suffering. And at the hands of some people that I had called my family members. When my grandfather chose to sell the house that I lived in with my mom when my great grandmother passed away, that was very much a painful moment in my life because there was a lack of empathy as to where would we go and what would happen of us. That required my forgiveness. When my mom chose to forgive my great grandmother for all of the hardships she experienced and still take care of her during the last few days of her life while she had cancer, that was a practice of forgiveness. When my grandmother came back into my great grandmother's home to take care of her during the last few months of her life, that was a practice of forgiveness. When I chose to forgive my neighbor at the time, who was also my friend, but who was very much angry, volatile, and wanting to be violent with me in that grade 8, grade 9 time when I was 13 and 14, that required a lot of forgiveness. It required forgiveness for me to then, I mentioned this last week, take it upon myself to be his tutor and to teach him what I knew and to want his well-being and his progress after all of that pain and suffering that I experienced prior to that point. So having the willingness to forgive was very much necessary in all of those moments. We all needed to be willing to forgive in the first place. And also understanding that holding on to the grudge and the negativity was causing us more internal suffering then was worth it. And so we needed to also have courage and willingness to let go of that grudge and negativity. And so throughout all that stress, it comes back to this idea that there are practices and techniques that we can put into place to make sure that stressful moments and stressful situations never overtake and overcome us. And when we realize that having a clear, calm, and peaceful mind is a superpower in this world of chaos and volatility, and with a peaceful, calm, and clear mind, that we can make decisions that are more aligned with what we want in life versus the stress, fears, and worries, then we can start to understand that prioritizing the peace of our mind is something that can be very much beneficial for who we are and who we want to be. And again, I want to talk about my stress relieving meditation course, which I've linked down below, and you can get it now with the free 45-minute coaching call, where I'm going to personally help you to overcome any obstacle, blockage, challenge, or stagnation that you're currently facing. I'm going to help you get clarity on that obstacle, blockage, challenge, or stagnation. And I'm going to also help you develop an action plan so that you can overcome that obstacle, blockage, challenge, or stagnation and take action on it as soon as possible, so that you can start to overcome the stresses that you're facing in your life regularly, be less prone to being thrown off by stresses and worries and fears, and start to make decisions that are more aligned with your peace, calm, and clear self, decisions that are more aligned with who you want to be. Take action on that course right now. Remember, the free coaching call is available for limited time only. And when you click in the link below and purchase the stress relieving meditation course, what you're essentially doing is that you are saying to yourself, I no longer want to be thrown around by life's hardships. I want to be able to gain a level of power and control over my life moments and my life journey on my life path. And I want to be able to do that by taking my mental well being into my own hands and also taking into account the power of my mind to create the things that I want to see. So don't hesitate on claiming the software. Click below and claim it right now. Get the stress relieving meditation course and start to practice meditation, the meditation that I personally use to regularly relieve my stress and to make sure that I always get my mind into a state of peace, calm, and clarity so that I can make the best decisions that are aligned with who I want to be and what I want to see in my life. It's available now. Click below and claim it. And let me help you to get clarity on those obstacles that you might be facing, develop an action plan, and start to take action immediately. Okay, so we've covered 2 lessons already. And the first lesson was about having willingness to forgive, and the second lesson was about understanding the negative impact of holding on to grudges and negativity. Let me take a second and have some tea again. Hope you don't mind. Let me plug the tea. It's a brand from Woolworths, and this tea is spearmint and ginseng, and it's meant to be some type of like energizing, calming, without high caffeine content, and it's very much soothing at the moment. Speaking throughout a 1 hour podcast can be relatively taxing on the voice and the throat. So thank you, tea, for nourishing me to continue. Okay, lesson 3 that I want to talk about is about practicing empathy. And one thing that I've seen as we continue to reflect on some of these moments throughout my life, where I've noted individuals and even myself repeatedly practicing forgiveness and also seeing the freeing effect that the practice of forgiveness has internally on one's mental and emotional burden, it brings to mind that when we practice empathy, what's important to recognize is the idea that the practice of empathy often comes with having the willingness to want to see things from someone else's perspective. And having the willingness to want to see things from someone else's perspective is a it is a courage. It's a nature of courage, and it's a step in the positive direction, and one that is so impactful and powerful to be able to put yourself in others' shoes. So, when practicing empathy, one thing that you always have to take into account is that all of us effectively react to situations relatively similarly. And one thing that I mentioned early on in the episode is that even though we go throughout life and we experiences these transgressions with various individuals, one thing that personally in my family we always keep in mind is that we always do have the willingness to forgive, and we we just want to be approached with earnestness, sincerity, and an apology so that we can bring forward the nature of forgiveness and put it into practice. Now, knowing that you might not always get the opportunity to be approached with an apology means that that is not necessarily a reliable way to go about life. We cannot necessarily always go about life waiting for the apology before we forgive, because we recognize that holding on to the negativity of that moment, it makes it challenging to create clear spaces for us to experience great and wonderful things. So when we practice the empathy, what we're essentially doing is that we're recognizing that, in the viewpoint of the other person, can we take into account that perhaps the hurt or the transgression was done unintentionally? And what if the person was actually doing what they thought was right at the time? And I know that this might be challenging to take into account at times, because we often want to villainize the other person or frame the other person as an antagonist. And at sometimes they are very much antagonizing. But what you find more often than not is that people are seeking to protect their own interests. And so, in seeking to protect their own interests, from your perspective, it might appear to be a transgression, but from their perspective, it might appear to be a way to protect themselves. The nature of empathy, it requires perspective taking. You often have to put yourself into the mind of the other person and try to understand, hey, what were you thinking when you were doing what you were doing? And when you do that specifically, what happens is that you start to alleviate some of the tension in your mind associated with that individual or set of individuals. When you alleviate that tension, what you're doing is that you're making it easier for the willingness to come into play. You're making it easier for the forgiveness to be practiced. You're making it easier for you to want to forgive and to do the forgiveness, even though you might not be receiving an apology. And you're essentially removing the obstacles to the apology, sorry, to the forgiveness, so that the forgiveness can be practiced simpler, easier, and you can start to let go of some of that mental, emotional, and physical burden and baggage. So, practicing the empathy, very much necessary. Doing the perspective taking, putting yourself into the mind of the other person can be very impactful and powerful for the nature of forgiveness. And the fourth thing that I want to hit home with the idea of forgiveness is that forgiveness cannot be a thing that you only start to consider practicing after a certain period of time. The best approach for forgiveness is the approach that um, people often take with mental health and with therapists, which is that you must not only approach your therapist when you're only facing a mental health crisis. It's important to approach your therapist all throughout your life consistently, so that when you are facing a mental health crisis, you are significantly equipped with the strength, the power, and the insight leading up to that point. And your mental health therapy and your mental health journey does not always become one about putting out fires and always confronting volatile moments. Similarly, if your practice of forgiveness becomes regular and consistent, and you are always practicing forgiveness throughout your life consistently and regularly, then those challenging and heavy moments that really demand a lot from you in terms of forgiveness will not take as much effort and energy to practice, because your forgiveness would be a regular practice. And that is lesson 4: developing a forgiveness routine. Developing a forgiveness routine makes it such that forgiveness becomes a lifestyle. And when forgiveness becomes a lifestyle, what you're essentially saying is that my practice of letting go of the mental and emotional and physical burden of grudges and negativity is so regular and consistent that I do it all the time. And it's not necessarily dependent on how big or significant something is. Someone could bump you as you're walking on the street and you practice forgiveness. Someone could send you a nasty email and you practice forgiveness. Someone could take a challenging action that was your friend and then they're not your friend anymore and you practice forgiveness. So no matter how the nature of the event that arises for you, if you're always practicing forgiveness, then forgiveness becomes a routine for you, and that is lesson 4. The idea of forgiveness is so profound, impactful, and important that it's very important that you take that seriously. And it's very important that you practice the self awareness to know when you're juicing the negative situation and you're stewing in the juice of feeling that you're righteous and justified in holding on to the negativity, and you're also righteous and justified in being a victim at the time. It's very much important to have self-awareness to recognize that it can be it can be a prideful, satisfying feeling to sit in negativity, but you have to have the courage to see internally that you are doing that, and to also see the negative effect of doing that, even though it might feel righteous, justified, and satisfying. That in the long run, you're actually blocking yourself off from having nice things. You're blocking yourself off from allowing the space for good things to come into your life, because that space is taken by the baggage of your grudge with someone or something or some event or circumstance. So, in summary, all throughout life, we will meet moments that try us and test us. We will meet moments of pain, suffering, and transgression. And we will meet moments where we have been hurt in some way, whether physically, emotionally, mentally. What will be required of us at the time is the practice of forgiveness. But first, we will have to overcome the internal satisfaction, righteousness, and justification of holding on to the grudge and feeling satisfied in being a victim. There are 4 lessons that we can put into place that make the practice of forgiveness easier. The first one is to have an attitude of willingness for forgiveness. What this means is that you approach your situation with a want and a desire to forgive. The attitude of willingness requires courage, it requires strength, it requires confidence, and it requires you wanting to forgive in the first place. Number 2, what makes it easier to forgive is to recognize the negative mental, emotional, and physical burden of holding on to the transgression and the grudge. Internally, we've heard this statement many times before: you cannot drink the poison and expect the other person to die. When you are drinking the poison, it is negatively affecting you internally. The third thing that's important to recognize, the third lesson about practicing forgiveness, is that an attitude of empathy is very much necessary. You have to be able to take the perspective of the other person, and to also keep in mind that they may not always have taken the attitude of being a transgressor, sometimes people are just looking out for their best interest, and in doing so, unintentionally hurt other people. So when you take the perspective of the other person, you're putting yourself in their shoes, and you're also helping yourself understand what they may have been experiencing at the time. And this makes it easier to practice forgiveness. The fourth thing is to develop a forgiveness routine whereby your forgiveness and your practice of forgiveness becomes a regular lifestyle. It becomes a practice that you're doing as an ongoing practice, regardless of the magnitude of event and regardless of where in your life you experience that event. You're always approaching with an attitude of forgiveness. And the main takeaway is to remember that forgiveness is something you do for yourself. It is very much important for your own well being, peace, and clarity. And when you practice forgiveness, you are making space in your life for great and wonderful things. So always do forgiveness, and remember that you can't rely on an apology before you do forgiveness, because that apology might never come. So practice the forgiveness and allow yourself to have nice things, and never hold on to the burdens of transgression, pain, and suffering, even though it might feel righteous, justified, satisfying at the time. We know now that that is all from an attitude of pridefulness. Yeah, reflecting on these moments throughout my life where I've had to practice forgiveness and seeing how forgiveness was modeled in my family by various family members, it makes me so grateful to have seen how forgiveness is done. And it makes me also so grateful to have gathered the courage to do forgiveness in some of the greatest and most significant challenges that I've ever experienced in my life. And now I can see, and I hope that you can also see, that as I've continued to forgive on my life journey, as I've continued to let go of pain, suffering, transgression, negativity, and grudges, what I've essentially done is that I've made space in my mind, in my body, to allow better and more wonderful things to come along. And allowing those, I've made space in my life for better and more wonderful things to come along. And I've made space in my life, and I've seen those better and more wonderful things come along. And I want to encourage you, as we reach the end of this episode, to never hesitate to practice forgiveness. If you if forgiveness comes to you as the first thing in mind whenever you feel the transgression hit, know that practice it immediately. Don't wait. Do it now. You deserve the peace, calm, and clarity of having a clear mind. And you know that whenever you've forgiven, you felt internally the release of that burden, and the feeling of that release, it is indescribable. It is so wonderful. Give yourself that more and have it. Have the peace, calm, and clarity of releasing the burden. One thing that makes it easier to release the burden, remember, is stress relieving meditation. And stress relieving meditation, it's something that I do regularly as an ongoing practice. And I want to be able to share that practice with you. And that's why I've linked down below my stress relieving meditation course. When you get the stress relieving meditation course that I've linked down below, and it's the course that I personally have created 12 video lessons for, where I personally teach you the stress relieving meditation that I use on a regular basis to relieve stress and to restore a sense of calm to my mind so that I can make better decisions. When you click down below and you get that course, for a limited time only, I'm going to offer you a free 45-minute coaching call. And in that call, I'm going to help you get more clarity on some of the challenges, obstacles, blockages, or stagnations that you might be experiencing in your life. I'm going to help you develop an action plan so that you can determine what action you can take in the present moment to overcome those obstacles. And I'm also going to help you gather the courage to be able to take action on that plan from today so that you can start to make decisions that are more aligned with what you want to see in your life and less aligned with the stress, fears, and worries that have been ruling you throughout this entire time. So don't hesitate. If you feel that you're being held back by something in your life, if you want to develop a routine and a technique to be able to overcome your stress regularly so that you can make better decisions that are more aligned with what you want and who you want to be, then click down below and get that course. And remember, the free coaching call is only available for a limited time only. So make sure to grab that opportunity to work with me and to start to take action on some of those things that matter to you, and to give yourself the opportunity to start thriving in your life, because we all deserve that type of life where we stop being victims, we stop enjoying the identity of survivor, and start adopting an identity of thriving, and allowing us to have that identity of, well, what does me thriving look like? And can I believe I deserve that? Yes, you deserve that, but you need to claim it. So take action, click down below, get that meditation course, and start to practice meditation. And like me, it's going to change your life. You're going to experience a huge and profound change in the trajectory of your life and the path that you're going down. It needs you to practice it for you to see the results. And I just want to encourage you to take action on that. Okay, we've reached the end of episode 2, and I'm so proud of having come to this point, because in episode 1, it was the beginning of fleshing out what does deep topics with Shaun look like, and we reflected on many life moments leading up to that point. And in episode 2, we started to reflect more on some of the challenging moments throughout my life where I experienced pain, suffering, hurt, transgression, and so forth, but always needed to approach it with an attitude of forgiveness. And having also reflected on various other family members that modeled forgiveness for me and showed me how it's done. And as I continue to practice forgiveness, it becomes easier, and forgiveness becomes a routine and a regular practice that I go throughout life doing regularly and as an ongoing routine. This is essentially a very much profound episode, because it shows you that not only is forgiveness possible, but there's a framework to doing forgiveness. And that framework is essentially 4 lessons that you can start to practice from today. Having the willingness to forgive, understanding the negative impact of holding on to grudges, practicing empathy and taking the perspective of the other individuals, and developing a routine of forgiveness so that becomes an ongoing practice. And with those 4 elements, as you continue to do them regularly, they will become very much easier to practice and an ongoing thing that you can do anywhere, anytime, to make sure that you're releasing the internal, mental, and emotional and physical burden of holding on to negativity. So give yourself nice things, allow yourself to have nice things, and make sure you take action. Get the course down below. And also, if you like this episode, make sure that you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and you're going to receive these episodes regularly. I think I've determined now that I'm going to do an episode of this podcast every week, and I'm going to release it on a Sunday. If you want to view this podcast on YouTube, you're viewing it right now. And if you want to listen to it on Spotify, you can also do that. There's a link for Spotify down below. Make sure to follow on all our platforms. Follow on Instagram, that's deep.meditator. Follow on TikTok, that's also deep.meditator. On YouTube, it's Deep Topics Podcast. And on Facebook, our page is called Deep Meditators Club, where across all these platforms, I continue to share regular resources so that I can help you to overcome stress. I can help you to thrive in today's fast paced world, and I can help you develop a mind of peace, calm, and clarity. Because at the end of the day, what we want is to be able to progress in our lives, and what we want is to be able to not just survive, but also thrive. We want to see the best version of ourselves. And when you access these meditation resources on the various platforms, whichever ones you're choosing to follow, then you give yourself the opportunity to know better. And when you know better, then you can do better. So I'm so glad and thankful and grateful that you decided to join this episode. Thank you again. And I hope to see you in next week's episode. I want to wish you well. I want to wish you well for the upcoming week. And thank you again. Take care. This is Shaun. Bye, everyone.